Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Take Your Shot podcast. Of course, as always, I am your wonderful host, Joshua Gitman. And last week in the NBA, absolute madness. We all thought the standings were pretty much setting themselves. We were projecting playoff matchups. And all of a sudden, teams go on winning streaks, teams go on losing streaks. We start to question some teams. We start to put some teams back on the map. That is the NBA as we near the end of the season with, I believe, 3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, left to go in the regular season before we get to the play-in and the playoffs. So there's been so many standing shifts, and we're going to talk about some teams who have some flaws. We're going to have another Lights Out segment. I forgot to do Lights Out Trailblazers last week, so we're going to get to them this week. Apologies on that. And we also have 3 more teams that we're going to say Lights Out to do. We've got a jam-packed episode today. So without further ado, without any hesitation, let's get right into it. So first, let's start with the team that has been absolutely shocking the NBA, making a late season push. Currently, a team on a 10-game winning streak, the Houston Rockets. The Houston Rockets have completely, all of a sudden, turned their season around. They were 8 games under 500. It was looking like a few more losses were probably going to eliminate them from playoff and play-in contention. And all of a sudden, Al-Farouq Sengun goes down. As I said, after that happened, the Rockets pretty much lost all hope. And then now, for some reason, the Houston Rockets have put themselves back on the map. They have a 10-game winning streak currently. They are sitting at 2 games over 500 as the 11 seeds. Be like, that's for the Western. That just shows how strong the Western Conference is. They're not even in the play-in, and they're still over 500. And what's most important is now they are 1 game. Yes, only 1 game behind the Golden State Warriors for that final play-in spot. The Warriors have been 500 up and down, but this Rockets team all of a sudden started winning games. So what is the biggest reason for this Rockets turnaround? Well, in my opinion, it's got to be Jalen Green. Jalen Green, this season, we know he had some issues to begin the season, wasn't really looking up to par for what Rockets fans had expected. He had a sophomore slump like a lot of second-year players do. But there was starting, and then this third year, he wasn't really picking it up as the way Rockets fans and most of the league thought he would. And all of a sudden, trade rumors started popping up for Jalen Green. It was like, where's he going to get traded to? Could he go to the Nets? Could the Rockets make a push for Mikal Bridges? There was just a lot of trade rumors for Jalen Green. And all of a sudden, in this 10-game winning streak, he has just been absolutely off the charts. Let me give you some stats on Jalen Green's improvement. In his first 60 games before this winning streak, first 62 games, before this 10-game winning streak, Jalen Green averaged 18 points per game, 4.5 rebounds per game, 3.5 assists per game, and was shooting 31% from the 3, which is not really good for an NBA player. Those are decent numbers. Jalen Green, that's a nice above average player's numbers in today's NBA. That's probably something that is a little disappointing for the Houston Rockets because they expected Jalen Green to break out. They did draft him as the second pick in the 2021 draft. So most people expected him to finally have that breakout year, finally be a superstar, but it wasn't really happening in the first couple of games. Now in these last 10 games, Jalen Green, ready for this, 30 points per game, 6.5 rebounds per game, 4 assists per game, and shooting a ridiculous 46% from the 3. That is a 15% jump in 3-point percentage, which that is ridiculous. That's pretty much if you're making 3 out of 10, now you're making 4.5 out of 10, which is a lot when you think about it. So Jalen Green's play has elevated for this Houston Rockets team, especially with Al-Farouq Sengun being out of the lineup for this Houston Rockets team, which if you're looking at, that is probably one of the big reasons why this Rockets team has been improved and has desirable playing contentions now. It's not even, but also pretty much every other player has been stepping up. Fred VanVleet's been playing his best basketball of the season. Jabari Smith Jr. has been playing his best basketball. Dylan Brooks has stepped it up on the defensive end, even though he needs to stay a little bit out of trouble on the court. But pretty much this Rockets team has been pretty much consistent. And from the beginning of the season, I thought this Rockets team had some potential to make a play-in spot. I think I had them as my 9th seed, but it wasn't really panning out for some reason. And I thought this team had the talent, and it didn't really go anywhere. And now all of a sudden it did. And one of the problems with Houston before Udoka came in was the defensive issues. And it pretty much was a little bit better to start these first 60 games of the season. But now the defense has improved immensely, which is another big reason why the Rockets are absolutely blazing. Let me give you some stats on defense. In these 10 games, the Houston Rockets became from a below average defense, like 20th defense, to all of a sudden looking like one of the top 3 defenses in the NBA. In these last 10 games, the Rockets are second in opponent 3-point percentage, so they're improving their 3-point defense. They are third in points per game allowed, which they were like 19th earlier. They are now 4th in defensive rating, which is absolutely bizarre from where the Rockets have been these past few years and where the Rockets were to start the season. And they are 9th in opponent overall field goal percentage. So the Rockets have really stepped it up on the defensive side of the ball, limiting teams' shooting percentages. And part of that reason is probably Ime Udoka. I really am a fan of Ime Udoka. I know he had those issues in Boston, but ever since he's gone to Houston, I feel like he would figure it out with this Houston Rockets team. Looking at that roster, the roster Udoka got surrounded with, it looked like that team had a lot of potential and something that they were flawed with in prior years. That's Udoka's specialty, the defensive side of the ball. And Udoka's a great coach, and he's figured it out, and the Houston Rockets are coming. The Houston Rockets are rising up the standings, and with 10 games to go, the Warriors better watch out, and they better not slip up, because the Houston Rockets are 1 game behind them. And ultimately, I probably still am going to lean a little bit toward the Warriors to get that final spot, but the Warriors have no room for error now. The Warriors have been playing a little bit better as of late. We're going to talk about them in a couple of minutes. But the way the Rockets have been playing, absolute madness, and it looks like it's probably going to continue. Looking at this Houston Rockets schedule, it's not necessarily the strongest. They've got the Jazz on the road, which is a winnable game. They've got Dallas, Minnesota, they've got Golden State at home, which is going to be a huge game, obviously, for that implications. They've got Miami at home. They've got Dallas again. They've got Orlando. And then the last couple are Utah, Portland, and the Clippers. I mean, the way that some of those teams have been playing as of late, like the Clippers or the Heat, and they still got Utah and Portland, Utah twice. These are winnable games for the Houston Rockets. The Rockets can start stacking up wins, and the Rockets can start winning games here. So the Warriors are going to have to watch out. Ultimately, I do think the Warriors will probably keep that spot. But it's really been a good sign of what Houston's been able to do, especially without their star center in Alfred Sengun, who probably would have been in the race for most improved player had it not been for his injury, keeping him out these last 20 games of the season. And who knows, if the Rockets somehow make the playoffs, he may come back, but probably not. But you never know. Houston could make a push, especially if they get there. But this is going to be one of the interesting storylines going down for the rest of the season. So Houston, absolute just shock probably to the entire league, the way they've absolutely came out of nowhere. And it's not like they've beaten crappy opponents. They've beaten the Kings. They've beaten the Cavaliers. They've beaten the Thunder. I mean, they've beaten some teams who are quality teams here in our NBA. So it's clicking at the right time for Houston, and we'll just have to wait and see down the stretch who will get that final play-in spot. And if the Warriors do not get the play-in spot, moving on, shifting to the Warriors, should they break up their core after this season? Because we know the Warriors have been absolutely incredible for years. But all of a sudden, these past few years, it's kind of gone downhill. They did win the title in 2022. They had an okay season in 2023, beating the Kings in 7 in that first round series as the 6th seed, then losing to the Lakers in the second round in 6 games. But this season, it's pretty much been a lot of issues for this Golden State Warriors team. They've had the Draymond issues from choking Gobert, stepping on Yusuf Nurkic. He literally got ejected the other day against the Magic, even though the Warriors held on to win that game. It's been up and down with him. Klay Thompson's season has been up and down, and Steve Kerr has had to talk with him about moving to the bench. I know he's been incorporated to the starting lineup, but most of the season, a lot of the season, I would say Klay Thompson has been coming off the bench, and it's been an adjustment for both the Warriors organization and Klay Thompson himself, because we know how good Klay Thompson has been over the years. Steph's playing great, but he's not playing to the level that he was in 2022. He was when he was younger. We've got to accept reality. He is getting older. But he's still playing amazing, like an MVP. Wiggins has probably had the worst season of his career here in Golden State. The only positive thing I can say about the Warriors is Jonathan Kuminga's emergence. Pretty much other than that, it's been an absolute disaster season for the Warriors. As I've been saying, they're barely hanging on to that final plan spot. So what happens if they don't get that final plan spot, or even if they do get that final plan spot? What should they do? I think, in my opinion, I think it's time to break this Warriors team up. We love what the Warriors did. The Warriors did it the right way. They won their titles. They built from the ground up. Steph, Draymond, Klay, 4 rings, absolutely incredible. And we will remember them as a dynasty. But I think it's time, if you're Golden State, to break everything up. I think you need to do right by Stephen Curry. I think you need to trade Steph Curry unless he really, really wants to be in Golden State forever. I think, depending on how many years he has left to go, I think it's maybe like 4 to 5 years with Curry. I think potentially you could do right by him to trade him. I think Klay Thompson definitely needs a fresh start with another team, maybe coming off the bench, maybe starting, but it's not really working out there in Golden State, and you're going to have to make costly decisions with Klay Thompson because you just paid Andrew Wiggins. You've got Chris Paul on this big contract right now. You just paid Draymond Green. So decisions are going to have to be made with Klay Thompson, and I think the Warriors might ultimately have to decide to let go of Klay Thompson. It's tough, but facing reality, looking for the future of this organization, you cannot stay in this middle of the pack. I think the Warriors are going to need a rebuild. They have the new general manager and Mike Dunleavy Jr., even though he was there under Bob Myers. I think what he should do, assert himself, say it's time for a change. Maybe potentially Steve Kerr retires. I don't know what the scenario is. Maybe he stays, but I think the Warriors need to trade some of their assets, get first-round picks, build around Jonathan Kuminga, and get younger players. So I really do think this dynasty is over. I think it's pretty much been over since 2022. Ever since, honestly, quite frankly, Draymond punched Jordan Poole, that it's pretty much gone haywire for Golden State. So I think the best option is probably finding a trade partner for Klay Thompson or letting him walk, potentially trading Draymond and getting rid of Wiggins as well and building around Jonathan Kuminga. Maybe Steph will stay, but you could potentially do right and help your future by trading Steph Curry as well. I think this will be a tough decision for Golden State because we know what they've done throughout all the years. We really, really love and appreciate what Golden State did for the game of basketball. But at the end of the day, it is a business in the NBA, and decisions are going to have to be made here for the better of the Warriors' future. Because if you keep holding on to this team, you're going to be in that second apron. And if you're in that second apron for multiple years, you're not even going to have a first-round pick to build around. So Golden State is going to have to make those tough decisions, and I think those tough decisions are going to happen this offseason, because I just can't see Golden State be stuck in this play-in zone for another 4 years? Like, how are you going to help your future? Because right now, and definitely for the foreseeable future, there's just no possible scenario where I see Golden State winning a championship, quite frankly, making a run in the postseason. So I said it. I think the Warriors should trade Steph Curry. I think they should blow it up, build around Kuminga, and see where they're at right now. So tough decisions, but that's what I think. But moving on, we've got an interesting story that happened in the NBA this week. Jontay Porter, the two-way player from the Toronto Raptors, also the brother of Denver Nuggets forward and one-time champion Michael Porter Jr., is being investigated by the NBA for prop bets put on him. There was prop bets put on him, and they're investigating to see if Jontay Porter were involved in these prop bet allegations. So what does this mean, this investigation, for the future of the NBA? First of all, Jontay Porter, it's pretty obvious that he probably actually is guilty of what they're investigating, because if you look at the situations, some of these sports books have reported that Jontay Porter player props are the most winnable bets of the night for multiple nights, when Jontay Porter is just a two-way player. And why are you betting a two-way player's player props? And they're all under. And some of these games, he's been re-aggravating an eye injury or just another knee injury or something like that. So every single time there's one of these his player props hits, he always has this other injury. So it's probably true. I'm not going to make predictions. I'm not calling Jontay Porter a bad guy. He is making $400,000 potentially. Looking at the rest of the NBA and what they're making, from the average salary being $10 million, he potentially wants some more money. But I'm not saying he 100% did it. That's just my prediction. But for the future of the NBA, this is something to definitely be investigated for. Not just the future of the NBA, but the future of sports itself. Because players now can absolutely just tank their stats at will. They can basically control player props. So if you're looking at this from an NBA standpoint, a college basketball standpoint, even the NFL, players can tank their own player props. So if you're at the leagues, you have to tell these sports books to shut down player props, because these guys can control player props. I mean, sports gambling has really raised in the industry lately, but these player props can get out of control and potentially some not be controllable. We had the Tim Donaghy situation 20 years ago, which is obviously different. It was a referee betting games, potentially fixing games, but Jontay Porter is shaving his stats. It's shaving his own stats. So you're potentially fixing games for the other team, and you're benefiting the other team. So the outcomes of games could potentially be fixed because of what Jontay Porter is doing. So this definitely needs to be an urgent situation for all sports leagues across America, probably all sports leagues across the world, because something needs to happen, because these players all of a sudden can just tank their player props. It's just so easy to do. And it makes no viable sense of why they're doing it. So if you are the league, you really need to investigate to this. And this is just a really, really sad situation for the NBA and for everybody involved, especially for the Raptors organization, because Darko Rajovic, the Raptors head coach, says he has no idea what's going on. Like, nobody had any idea what's going on. This can happen so easily. So this situation really needs to be looked at for the future of the NBA, and we really need to do something about it. I don't know if that's eliminating player props. I don't know what that is. Potentially, maybe suspending Jontay Porter for a significant period of time, maybe banning him from the NBA. I don't know what that punishment is, but I think the NBA needs to make a statement with this, because this is absolutely unacceptable. This is fixing games, and if you are a fan of the game, you look at the NBA fixing games, not necessarily the NBA, but players fixing games, refs fixing games. This is not a very good look for the league, so something is going to have to happen. That's my take on that situation. But moving on from that storyline this week for Jonte Porter, let's talk about the Boston Celtics, because the Boston Celtics have clinched the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference officially. Their record is off the charts. They are currently 59-14, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know the exact record on the top of my head, but the Boston Celtics have been absolutely destroying the league, up 57-16, overvaluing them a little bit. They're 57-16. But in these last 2 games, the Boston Celtics have lost to the Atlanta Hawks twice. Their first game, they have blown a 15-point lead. Excuse me, not a 15-point lead, a 30-point lead to the Atlanta Hawks in their first game against Atlanta. And then in their second game, they lost again to Atlanta, 2 games in a row to the same team. And an Atlanta team they lost to does not have Trae Young currently. Jalen Johnson was also out of the lineup. So this is a very, very concerning sign for the Boston Celtics. Even though they do have the number 1 seed locked up, even though they have looked by far like the best team in the league, are the Celtics really above everybody else? And I'm going to say no, because looking at Boston the past few years in the playoffs, we know we've seen it before. We've seen it every single year in this playoffs. Boston all of a sudden just disappears for some reason. I have no idea why. Honestly, quite frankly, I'm surprised that they just disappear. They look like they have games locked up in the postseason, and all of a sudden it just goes away. For some reason, it makes no sense, but this has been happening for Boston. They've been losing playoff games at home because of it, and the only time they're really focused is if they're desperate and if they are on the verge of elimination. But if it's just a playoff game or any other game, a regular season game, they all of a sudden just lose their guard, and it makes absolutely no sense to me, no sense to, quite frankly, anybody else. So I'm really going to say no to this question. I don't think Boston's really above anybody else. From what I've seen from Boston the past few years, from what I've seen from Boston these past 2 games, Boston is a beatable franchise. Somebody can beat Boston, even in the Eastern Conference. People are saying Boston can cruise to the conference finals. No, they not the NBA finals and the conference finals, but no, they cannot, because there are teams that can beat them in the Eastern Conference. Milwaukee has improved a lot lately. The Knicks could give Boston some trouble when Boston's playing offense, especially because the Knicks have an elite defense. The Miami Heat have beaten them twice in 4 years. Could they give them more trouble? We've got teams who can probably score like the Boston Celtics, such as a team like the Indiana Pacers. So there are teams out there who can give the Boston Celtics trouble, and I think Boston has the same chance as anybody else to move on, because they're just showing they have flaws, and they really do have flaws, and they have major concerns that they're going to have to fix up, or else if another early elimination in the playoffs happen again, if they lose to a team they shouldn't lose to, if another disappointing loss, again, we are going to start having to question whether Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown can be on the same team. And quite frankly, if it happens again where Boston loses disappointingly, I believe that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown should be broken up. And then this offseason, you're going to have to extend Drew Holiday. Are you going to really pay Drew Holiday all that money? It's going to be, especially if Boston loses, an interesting offseason for them, which is why I believe that Boston, it's beatable, because the problem is when I saw these Atlanta games, at the end of these Atlanta games, Boston gets stagnant. Boston doesn't know what to do. Joe Mazzulla doesn't use his timeouts. They get stagnant on the offensive side of the ball. They hold the ball until the shot clock ends. Nobody knows what to do. They all just stand still. It's one-on-one isolation. They take a contested shot. They have no idea what they're doing. The contested shot falls out, and they're giving teams opportunities to win games, to come back in games. And that's what happened when they were up 30 against Atlanta the other day. They were completely stagnant pretty much the whole second half. They let Atlanta back into the game, and it was absolutely a disaster for this Boston Celtics team. And another reason why Boston is not above everybody else is their three-point shot. They rely too much on the three-point shot. And when that three-point shot does not go in for Boston, which we have seen countless times in the playoffs, which we have seen countless times in their losses this season, when the three-point shot does not go in, this Boston team all of a sudden becomes just an average team, because this team relies way too much on the three-point shot, and they easily allow teams to get back into ball games. And we saw it in both games against Atlanta this past week. We've seen it in the playoffs. So if Boston cannot shoot the ball, if a good defensive team plays them and they really guard them and stop them from the three-point line, this Boston Celtics team is beatable, and this Boston Celtics team may lose early. And in the Western Conference, I can name you probably 4 teams that can probably beat the Celtics team in a 7-game series. Obviously, Denver's up there. You've got to consider the Clippers. Even though they've been up and down lately, you've got to put the Clippers on that list. You can make an argument for Oklahoma City beating this team potentially. You can make an argument for even Dallas to beat this Boston Celtics team the way Dallas's offense runs. So it's just, for Boston, they've really got to figure out this issue. From the inconsistent three-point shooting shots, they get stagnant, they get tight, and they've really got to figure this out. And somebody's got to hold them accountable. And the problem with that is they traded their one person that we know holds people accountable in Marcus Smart to Memphis for Kristaps Porzingis coming from Washington. I mean, Porzingis has played absolutely incredible this season, and he's been a big X factor. But Marcus Smart is a huge loss for this Boston Celtics team. And if we see them lose, we're going to look back and say they were not disciplined. They were not held accountable with Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown. And one of the reasons is because of Marcus Smart being gone, because Marcus Smart was one of the best leaders in the NBA. He holds the entire team accountable. He holds the staff accountable. He holds the superstars accountable. And we've really got to consider that when looking at this Boston Celtics team, because Marcus Smart for years was a huge part of this Boston Celtics team, and now all of a sudden he's just gone. So this is a huge issue for Boston. They do have a lot of issues, and looking at it, I think they're beatable. I think Milwaukee can take it to a 7-game series. I think Miami could make a series potentially interesting, maybe 6 or potentially even 7 as well. I think the Knicks could make a series interesting with them. They are absolutely beatable, and they have to figure out how to not be stagnant and not be tight when momentum is not on their side, because what makes good teams great is if another team's making a run, if they're not shooting well, they step it up on the defensive side of the ball. They move the ball around. They're not stagnant, because this team is absolutely lethal. We all know it. They're starting 5 of Holiday, White, Brown, Tatum, Porzingis, absolutely lethal. The best starting 5 in the league, probably not even close. But the problem is they get stagnant, they don't move the ball around, and they just panic, and it affects them not only on the offensive side of the ball, but the defensive side of the ball as well. And quite frankly, Mazzulla doesn't really do anything to help. He doesn't call his timeouts. And it just continues that way, and teams can easily come back on them if that were the case, because we know this team can win any game by 30. They can probably lose any game being up 30. That's the scary part with this Boston Celtics team. They are inconsistent at the end of games. I do not trust them in crunch time. I quite frankly don't trust Tatum in the crunch. I don't trust Jaylen Brown in the crunch. I don't trust Joe Mazzulla in the crunch time. This is a very concerning sign for the Boston Celtics, and they really need to figure it out, or else this offseason will be very, very interesting for the Celtics team. What is going to happen to Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum? We don't know, but we know one thing for sure. Boston is beatable because they are stagnant and they do not know how to close games, and we have seen this for years and years and years, and it doesn't matter how good of a starting 5 they have. It doesn't matter who's the coach. They are stagnant, and they are not a good team in the clutch. And if you keep teams in games, teams will come back on you. And if Boston doesn't figure this out, it's going to be a long one this offseason. So hopefully Boston gets that situation figured out. But I want to move on to our second part of our new segment, Lights Out, where we discuss eliminated teams. We've got 4 for you today. We've got 2 teams from the West, 2 teams from the Eastern Conference. Let's first do a team that I forgot to do last week, the Portland Trailblazers. Unfortunately, their lights are out. Portland this season, after trading Dame, has been an absolute disaster, full of injuries, full of disappointments, just a lot of in and out of the lineup, a lot of inconsistencies, just a lot of relying on certain players, guard-heavy team. And this Portland team, it's going to be a long ride for them. Potentially, DeAndre Ayton hasn't really played his best of what Portland thought when they traded for him. Jeremy Grant has been in and out of the lineup. Chris Murray hasn't been that great. Scoot Henderson has been a disappointment so far this season. This has just really been an awful season for the Portland Trailblazers. And it is the first season of the rebuild, so we'll give them a little leeway. But Portland this offseason should really look and consider trading Jeremy Grant, because for some reason, we don't know why, but they gave Jeremy Grant that huge 5-year, $160 million contract. We don't know why, especially after trading Damian Lillard, after going into a rebuild. It makes absolutely no sense for this team. But what Portland needs to do, Portland needs to draft a slashing forward this year, someone who is a 3-and-D forward who can really space the floor with their guards, Scoot Henderson, Shady and Sharp, Anthony Simons, and run the wing, because it's going to be a process for Portland, because it's going to be a long time before this Portland team gets good. Because looking at this roster, we really didn't see a lot from Scoot this year that we would have liked to see. Simons has been decent. Shady and Sharp has pretty much been injured his whole career so far. DeAndre Ayton has been disappointing. As I said, this Portland team really needs to reevaluate their current roster, potentially move some pieces around, get more young players to build around, get more draft capital, and just really do a full rebuild here, because Jeremy Grant being on the team is concerning. Malcolm Brogdon being on the team is concerning. Why are you holding those players when you're just holding up minutes for the other guys? Like, look at all the guards Portland has. You really need a 4th guard with Brogdon. Jeremy Grant, you didn't really need to be there. You could have started Tamari Karamara, who's absolutely been one of the positives of Portland this season, coming with DeAndre Ayton from Phoenix. Some Portland drafted him in the 2nd round. He's been one of the positive parts. So you could have started him and developed him and have more draft capital at the same time. So I don't know what Portland's doing. It's going to be an interesting offseason for them, reevaluating their team and seeing what they can do to best prepare themselves for the future. We'll still never know if that Damian Lillard trade was the best option. When looking back at it, they had an offer from Miami on the table with Jaquez, Jovic, probably, and others. Jaquez has been pretty amazing when given the opportunity to score the ball, and he's probably the slashing forward that this Portland Trailblazers team could have used. So I'm not saying it was a bad trade what they did, getting all those draft picks, but potentially we don't know what's going to happen there. Robert Williams III was injured this year. They're probably going to trade him this offseason, even though I think he should be somebody that they keep. There's been a lot of rumors that they're going to trade him this offseason. So I think Portland's making a lot of wrong decisions here with this rebuild, and I think they need to stop, settle, reevaluate themselves, draft the players they need to surround their guards, and just go from there, because this Portland team doesn't look like it's going to have a strong future anytime soon unless they just reevaluate themselves, because this has just been an absolute disaster, something that we really didn't expect from Portland to be this bad. 19-54. That's really, really bad for this Portland Trailblazers team. We expected Scoot Henderson to be a lot better. Part of that is his inconsistencies, not being healthy. But maybe we'll give it another year for Portland, let their guards be healthy and see what happens. But what I do think they need to do cash in Jeremy Grant, cash in Malcolm Brogdon for draft capital before their value declines. That's what they should do, and that's my take on Portland. So let's say lights out to Portland, and let's move on to another team that has had an interesting season, making some moves at the trade deadline. The Charlotte Hornets. We say lights out to the Charlotte Hornets. The Charlotte Hornets are currently sitting at a 13th in the Eastern Conference, if I'm not mistaken. They are at 18-54. LaMelo Ball has pretty much been out for half this season. Charlotte made a lot of moves at the deadline, reevaluating themselves, going to a full rebuild and building around LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller. They traded Terry Rozier to the Heat. They traded Gordon Hayward to the Thunder. They traded PJ Washington to the Dallas Mavericks. They got some nice assets back. Charlotte did. They got Trey Mann, who they developed quite nicely for the Charlotte Hornets team. They've also gotten some other players like Seth Curry. They've gotten Grant Williams. They've gotten some more draft capital. They've gotten Vlasi Micic. So this team has been a little bit better. They've been injured a lot this season, but they have looked a little bit better from the trade deadline. They look like they're in a better position with the draft picks. Obviously, there's still a long way to go for the Charlotte team. You could make the case that Charlotte could trade LaMelo Ball and completely start the rebuild around Brandon Miller, especially considering LaMelo Ball's health has been absolutely terrible ever since he's entered the league. But I think they should probably stick with LaMelo Ball because he is a very promising player. I think Steve Clifford probably may have to go. I don't think he may be the right voice for this team. I think he's a decent coach, but I think for a rebuilding team, I think they need a young coach, someone to assert themselves, someone to really be a huge voice and a leader for that team. So I potentially think Charlotte may have to look at firing Steve Clifford once more. And I think they need to cash in on their draft picks. I think their center's good with Mark Williams. Mark Williams has been good. Brandon Miller's good. I think what they need to do is probably get either a power forward or a shooting guard to surround their guys with. Probably more leaning toward a power forward in the draft, surrounding LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller, because I like Mark Williams as well. So I think they should keep Mark Williams and start him. Potentially a shooting guard as well, because Seth Curry is not your future starting shooting guard. If the Hornets can do that, potentially trade some of their guys like Seth Curry and others like Davis Bertans, let him walk. I think Charlotte's going to be okay. It's going to be a process, obviously, but I think they probably need to evaluate where they're at right now, look at who's been injured, look at the voice in the locker room, see where they're at with Steve Clifford, and take their time, because Brandon Miller is absolutely incredible. From what we've seen from Brandon Miller this season, he was absolutely the right decision for the Charlotte Hornets. We question whether they should have actually drafted Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller, who's had his ups and downs. But ultimately, they drafted Brandon Miller, and so far for Charlotte, fingers crossed for them, he has been the right decision for that organization. So he will be a huge piece. He will be an all-star in the future because he is that incredible when we watch him play. But again, Charlotte needs to reevaluate themselves, see where they're at, draft a power forward or a shooting guard, because one of the reasons that I didn't mention also is Miles Bridges is probably going to not be with the Charlotte Hornets team. They're probably going to let him walk. So there's a spot at the power forward. So if Charlotte does that, I think they'll be fine. I think they had a great trade deadline getting all the draft capital that they did. And just give it a few more years and potentially let LaMelo develop into an all-star, let Brandon Miller develop into a superstar, cash in on the draft picks, and I think the Hornets will be just fine. But if LaMelo Ball does have more injury inconsistencies next season, the offseason after that, I think the Hornets might have to consider trading LaMelo. But for right now, I would keep LaMelo, build around Miller and him, keep Mark Williams. I like him. And make good draft decisions, because the Charlotte team could have been a disaster keeping all those guys at the trade deadline with no extra draft capital, but they did get the draft capital, and they do look a lot more promising than they did 4 months ago or at the start of the season. So Hornets are moving in the right direction. So we say lights out to them. Hopefully they have a better season next season, but who knows? And let's move on to another team in the Western Conference as we say lights out to the Utah Jazz. The Utah Jazz have been one team that we know has been on a rebuild ever since they traded Gobert to the Timberwolves 2 years ago and Donovan Mitchell, where they got all those draft assets. They look to be in a good position. Keontae George, who they drafted this year with the 15th pick, I forget which pick he was drafted with. Absolute steal for them. Keontae George has been playing lights out for this Utah team. Well deserving, earning a starting role for that team. Lauri Markkanen doing Lauri Markkanen things. You've got Taylor Hendricks there as well, hasn't been that bad. He's been a little bit up and down, inconsistent, but Taylor Hendricks has been okay for them. They've got Jordan Clarkson off the bench. You've got Colin Sexton, Chris Dunn, John Collins there starting for you. Utah is probably in a okay position for now. They may want to consider trading Lauri Markkanen, but I think building around him may not be a bad decision with Keontae George because this team, for a stretch of the season, showed a lot of promise. They were in the playoffs for a little bit. Remember, they had that 7-game winning streak that we were talking about earlier this season. They've shown that they can win quality ball games. I think maybe you could trade Clarkson, not necessarily need him anymore with the emergence of Keontae Johnson. But I think other than that, I think the Utah Jazz are going in the right direction. They have the draft capital. The Thunder really hit on theirs. I think it's going to be a process for Utah, just like every other team. But out of all the teams that we have said lights out to so far, the Utah Jazz are clearly in a more superior position than any of the rest. I think Will Hardy is definitely the right coach for this team. He is a nice young voice, an energetic voice that can really help this team succeed. So I think he's okay to stay. And I think other than that, like looking at this Utah team, it's been great. It really hasn't been that bad of a season for Utah. I know they probably wish they could have won more games, but as I said, Keontae George has really been a hit for them with the 16th pick. Not the 15th, the 16th pick. Really been a hit for them. They have a lot of draft picks in the future. Markkanen plays like an all-star and will be an all-star for years to come. I think potentially they could trade Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson. But other than that, as I've said, Utah's in a comfortable position. There's not really a lot to talk about this Utah team. They're very, very good, and they're very, very prepared for the future. So lights out Utah. They've got a long process left ahead of them, but they are moving in 100% the right direction. They have hit on their draft picks so far, and hopefully they hit on their draft picks again, and Utah could potentially try to fight for a play-in spot next year because this team is young, this team is feisty, and this team will be a threat in the future for the Western Conference. Now let's say lights out to our final team, the Toronto Raptors. As we say, lights out Toronto. The Toronto Raptors have been officially eliminated from the Eastern Conference playoff contention, currently sitting at the number 12 spot at 23-50 this season. We did not expect Toronto to be this bad. Obviously, Masai Ujiri made those tough decisions at the trade deadline to trade Pascal Siakam, to trade to the Pacers for Bruce Brown and draft capital, to trade OG Anunoby to the Knicks for RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley. They got Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji from the Utah Jazz, but they gave up a first-round pick. So Toronto, Masai Ujiri's process hasn't really been making sense. They should be on a full rebuild. I don't think they got the draft assets they should have in that Pascal Siakam trade. I don't understand why they would give up a first-round pick for Kelly Olynyk. That really makes no sense to me. Looking at the state of this roster, I mean, Barrett's done okay for this team. Quickley has really stepped up to be the starting point guard when he is healthy. Scotty Barnes has been playing like an all-star, deservedly so. He has been absolutely incredible. And this Toronto team has been they're trying to move in the right direction, but I just didn't really understand some of the moves they made at the trade deadline. It's really ever since they won that title, it's really been downhill for Toronto, and I don't really know what direction they're trying to go, if they're trying to reload rather than rebuild. I mean, I like RJ Barrett. I mean, I like Emmanuel Quickly, but looking at the long-term future of this team, it probably would have been better off if the Toronto Raptors cashed out and got draft capital. I think what they need to do in this draft is draft a shooting guard, not a shooting guard, a power forward in this draft to get a nice lineup of Quickly, Barrett, Scotty Barnes, the power forward, and Kelly Olynyk. I don't really understand why they traded for Kelly Olynyk, but whatever, they're committing to him. So potentially draft a power forward to surround that team, replace Pascal Siakam. And I think Toronto will be okay there. That's a nice starting five to build around. But Toronto's really banking on RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickly to take steps up next season, which for Emmanuel Quickly, we may be able to count on that. For RJ Barrett, he's really been this consistent level player. He really hasn't improved. He's pretty much been this consistent 18 to 20 point per game scorer. Not really looking to me like he's going to jump to that all-star level quite soon, but I think Quickly could. I think Quickly does have the potential now that he's been freed up starting at point guard. I think he does. I think if Scotty Barnes makes another jump, I think Toronto will definitely be in the play-in conversation next year. But I do think if they have to, trade Gary Trent Jr., get a first-round pick, send him to a contending team. They don't really need him anymore. I think Grady Dick hasn't been really the best draft pick for them. He's really been up and down this season, but when he has been up, it's looked really, really good. So if he is consistent, I think Toronto will be just okay. And Bruce Brown, I think they could also trade him this offseason as well, because Bruce Brown is clearly not needed for this roster. Could trade him to a contender for a first-round draft pick. And that's it, man. Just trade some of those guys to hope they're banking on RJ Barrett and Quickly's development. And if that doesn't work, I don't know where this Toronto team will be. But if it does work, I think the future is bright for Toronto. Could have made some better decisions, but they're gambling and taking the risk on RJ Barrett being an all-star player. And we'll just have to wait and see what this Toronto Raptors team will be. And I think that's pretty much it for today. We've had a really interesting week, and it has been absolutely incredible to do this. And actually, I have one more thing, a big announcement. I'm going to tell you in 1 second. The big announcement is that we are going to move to multiple episodes in the playoffs. We are going to do potentially shorter videos previewing playoff series, previewing play-in games, recapping playoff games, recapping play-in games. I think we're going to do some shorter episodes, but they're going to be more frequently per week. So I'm very excited for that. As the playoffs come, we will probably lead up more to that. So that's going to be incredible. So it's that time. We're getting closer to that time of playoff basketball. We've got that first seed in the Western Conference race. We've got this 3 through 5 race now with New York, Cleveland, and Orlando. The 3 seed probably crucial to try to avoid Boston. We've got still the 6, 7, 8 race in the East with the Magic, Pacers, Heat. We've got the Pelicans have really been winning, and the Clippers have fallen off a little bit. So we've got this 4-5 race. Dallas and Sacramento are playing a huge 2-game series this week to determine who gets the tiebreaker there. Currently, Dallas is ahead in that department. They won their first game by 30, but I think they play again tonight against Sacramento in Sacramento. We've got as I said, we've got the Lakers trying to move up and trying to stay where they are and not drop down to the 10 or get out of the play-in. And obviously, as we talked about in today's show, we've got Houston knocking on the door of the Golden State Warriors. So it's going to be a really interesting few weeks in the NBA, determining those final play-in spots, determining who is in the playoffs, who's in the play-in, determining those crucial seed races in both conferences. So buckle up your seatbelt and get ready for an absolute incredible finish to the season and get ready for the playoffs. So that's all my time for you today. I've pretty much talked about what I've wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for watching the show. And remember, please follow on Spotify, Take Your Shot Podcast, and on Instagram at take_your_shot_podcast_. Again, on Instagram, that's at take_your_shot_podcast_. And tell me how you would have taken your shots on these takes. That's all my shots for today, folks. See you next time, and let's get ready for the final stretch of the NBA season.